They said it was fantasy, that voices in your head were a sign of illness, that weapons capable of controlling minds only existed in films. But the Secret Service archives contain documents. In patents, there is technology, and in the shadows of history, there are experiments that make your blood run cold. Psychotronic weapons. They exist. Or did they exist? Or are they already being used? What are the Soviet and American mind control projects hiding? Today, we will reveal what they have long tried to forget. When, in the middle of the 20th century, the world was finally divided into two camps, capitalist and socialist, a much more mysterious struggle unfolded behind the scenes of the familiar arms race. Its goal was not cities or territories. It was fought for something much more fragile and vulnerable, the human mind. The Soviet Union and the United States came to the same conclusion almost simultaneously. If weapons can destroy bodies, then it must be possible to create technologies that can influence the mind. This field became so important that funding for such research was not only approved, but guarded as a top state secret. In the Soviet Union, the first serious experiments in this field began in the 1930s, when enthusiasts inspired by the work of academician Bekhterev and Pavlov's followers began to investigate the possibility of transmitting mental commands over a distance. At the time, this was called radiosuggestion. In the post-war years, these developments were transformed into projects involving dozens of institutes, military laboratories, and secret units. One of the first and most high-profile experiments was research with so-called operators, people who, according to scientists, had the ability to transmit signals over long distances. These experiments were kept strictly secret, under the control of the KGB, behind the sealed doors of facilities near Moscow. Volunteers attempted to influence the behavior of animals and other people in neighboring rooms, sometimes at distances of hundreds of kilometers. The protocols recorded deviations, coincidences, increased anxiety, and even spontaneous aggression in the test subjects. Meanwhile, across the ocean, in the United States, one of the CIA's darkest projects was launched, the mkultra program. But we'll talk about that later. For now, it is important to understand that both sides of the conflict came to the same conclusion almost simultaneously. The war of the future would be won by those who learned how to program people, and this could be achieved not only through propaganda and fear, but also through technology. In the mid-1950s, the first publications on the influence of high-frequency fields on human behavior appeared in the USSR. Strangely enough, this research was not immediately classified. On the contrary, it was published in scientific journals, but from a different angle. The authors pointed to the possibility of creating contactless brain stimulation for the treatment of mental disorders. However, such articles soon disappeared from public access. The research was moved to closed laboratories. At the same time, a new direction was forming within the so-called Psychotronic program, the study of the psychoenergetic properties of humans. At this time, the concept of torsion fields was introduced into scientific discourse, which were supposedly capable of transmitting information over distances without the use of classical electromagnetic waves. Today, this sounds like pseudoscience, but at the time, these ideas were studied by serious scientists and funded by the state. A core group of specialists was formed who were allowed to participate in these experiments. Many of them had academic degrees and worked at the Brain Institute, the Institute of Psychology of the USSR Academy of Sciences, and in structures of the Ministry of Defense. Their task was ambitious: to create a device that would allow them to change mood, suppress will, or, conversely, induce euphoria and submissiveness. Thus, by the end of the 1960s, the race to create psychotronic weapons had become not just a theory, but a very real program, the existence of which was officially denied but acknowledged within a small circle of insiders. And that was only the beginning. While in the Soviet Union, mind control research was conducted within the walls of institutes and military laboratories classified as top secret in the United States, it took on a much darker form. Its name was mkultra. It was not just a CIA project. It was a real nightmare hidden in the shadows of democracy and progress. The mkultra project was launched in the early 1950s, immediately after the end of World War II. Inspired by reports of Nazi and Japanese experiments on humans, American intelligence agencies sought not just to replicate what they had seen, but to surpass it. In this context, an idea was born. What if human consciousness could be reprogrammed using chemicals, electroshock, hypnosis, and audiovisual stimuli? The project was funded through secret budget lines. In its first few years alone, mkultra consumed tens of millions of dollars. The names of those involved were usually kept secret, and the experiments themselves were conducted in psychiatric clinics, universities, and even military bases. Everything was done under the strictest secrecy. The test subjects were often uninformed patients, prisoners, students, and even civilians enrolled in programs under the guise of therapy. The most famous branch of mkultra was the use of LSD. Researchers hoped that this substance would open the mind and make people suggestible. In reality, everything turned out to be much more tragic. Patients were subjected to multi-day sessions under the influence of drugs, with electric shocks and repetitive commands. Some of them lost their memory. Others went insane. There were cases of suicide, but the most sinister part was that many of these experiments were not properly documented. An order to destroy part of the archives was issued in the mid-1970s, when the scandals surrounding the leaks began to spread beyond the laboratories. Nevertheless, some of the documents were saved. 86 files were made public under the Freedom of Information Act. Their contents shocked even those who already suspected the scale of what was happening. These files described experiments involving sensory deprivation, when a person was placed in complete silence and darkness for long hours or even days. There were cases where devices were implanted under the skin of test subjects to continuously stimulate their nerve endings. Detailed descriptions were given of methods for creating artificial split personalities, which were supposed to allow agents to act under someone else's program without being aware of their mission. Real protocols, real names. Against this backdrop, Soviet projects looked more academic. However, the USSR also had its own shadow zones. One such area was Program No. 5, a classified research complex operating within the walls of the Institute of Psychology and, in parallel, at military facilities. As part of this program, experiments were conducted on the effects of low-frequency magnetic fields on human behavior. Researchers noted cases of unmotivated anxiety, decreased volitional activity, and even temporary loss of consciousness. They were particularly interested in the possibility of imposing simple commands such as stop, turn, and be quiet. To this end, devices were created that generated pulses supposedly capable of affecting certain areas of the brain. The generators themselves looked like massive boxes with antennas and coils. Conscripts, government employees, and prisoners in special prisons were used as test subjects. No public information about Program Number 5 existed until the late 1990s. It was only after the collapse of the Soviet Union that mentions of it began to surface in interviews with retired colonels and former scientific staff. One of them, Alexander Chernobrov, claimed that the program involved experiments with altering the perception of time and a state of semi-sleep in which a person remains physically active but loses critical thinking. There were more than a few such projects in both the Soviet Union and the United States. However, it was mkultra and Program No. 13 that became symbols of an era when science began to work not to understand humans, but to create new types of weapons. Weapons that do not shoot, but are capable of making a person shoot themselves. While the public discussed the possible use of hypnosis and LSD to control people, work was underway behind closed laboratory doors on fundamentally different technologies. The focus of interest was on microwaves, radio frequency fields, ultra and infrasound. A hypothesis arose that the human brain is not only a biological organ, but also a resonant system capable of receiving and interpreting external signals. If this is the case, then it can be tuned like a radio receiver. Back in the early 1960s, a group of American researchers led by Alan Frey discovered that people are capable of perceiving certain radio frequency signals not with their ears, but directly through their skulls. This phenomenon was called the Frey effect. Volunteers reported hearing clicks, metallic sounds, or even voices, even though the room was completely silent. No acoustic sources were used. Everything happened due to directed microwave pulses in the range from several hundred megahertz to several gigahertz. It was this effect that became the basis for dozens of future patents. Among them is the well-known patent number 6,516,302, registered in the United States in the late 1990s. It describes a method of transmitting sound signals directly to the human brain using modulated radio frequency radiation. The text explicitly mentions the possibility of use in military and special operations. But while in the United States this was at least mentioned in patent bulletins, in the Soviet Union similar work was carried out in the strictest secrecy. In the early 1980s, experiments with millimeter wave generators were conducted at the Research Institute of Radio Engineering and Electronics. According to scientists, these devices caused test subjects to experience feelings of unease, a state of mild panic, and even brief disorientation in space. Infrasonic devices were of particular interest. They were based on massive oscillating mechanisms capable of generating sound waves with a frequency below the threshold of audibility, less than 20 Hz. It turned out that at a certain power, such waves could cause headaches, nausea, anxiety, and even hallucinations in humans. The secrecy surrounding this research was so high that many scientists did not even know what their colleagues in neighboring laboratories were working on. At the same time, a field later called neurointerfaces began to take shape. In collaboration with military structures, engineers and neurophysiologists attempted to create a device that could not only read brain signals but also transmit commands to the brain. The projects had mixed success, but prototypes of suggestion helmets already existed. Massive structures worn on the subject's head that generated variable electromagnetic fields. According to the developers, such devices could alter a person's emotional state, inducing a state of mild euphoria or depression. In the West, similar work was supervised by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Reports from the late 1980s mention the development of neuronavigation systems and prototypes of systems for influencing cognitive functions. The term information psychological weapon even appeared, referring to methods of remote influence on a person with the aim of changing their perception of reality. As a result, by the early 1990s, both sides had accumulated a huge amount of data. However, not a single publicly available model of such a weapon was created. All developments remained at the testing stage, in the form of prototypes and secret reports. This created a special atmosphere, as if the weapons existed, but it was impossible to prove it. It was in this atmosphere that numerous rumors and speculations began to form. Numerous references appeared in popular culture, from novels to films. The main characters began to hear voices, lost touch with reality, and became victims of unknown influences. It would seem that this is all fiction. But if you carefully study the chronology of scientific publications, patents, and classified reports, it becomes clear that humanity has seriously approached the threshold beyond which mind control begins. Only one step remains. Perhaps the most frightening part of the whole story about psychotronic weapons is the testimony of people who claim to hear voices in their heads. This is not schizophrenia or hallucinations, at least not always. Many of them are former military personnel, Secret Service agents, and scientists who suddenly began to hear clear commands, instructions, and sometimes even threats that no one else could hear. And all these voices usually had one thing in common: the feeling that they were coming from outside. In the mid-1990s, the term targeted individuals began to gain popularity in the United States. These are people who, according to their own statements, have become victims of neuropsychotronic persecution. At first, their stories were dismissed as another bout of paranoia. However, as the cases multiplied and the descriptions became more similar, interest in the topic began to grow. Some of these people claimed that their thoughts were being mirrored by someone from outside, that they felt pain, pressure, and anxiety that could not be explained medically. Against this backdrop, documents leaked from DARPA and other American agencies mentioning tests of so-called V2K technology, voice-to-skull, attracted public attention. According to this information, special equipment could transmit coded audio signals directly to the human brain, bypassing the ears. This worked by means of directed microwave pulses that caused micro-vibrations in the tissues of the skull, which were interpreted by the brain as sound. Patents for such technologies do exist, and among them there are even some that describe the transmission of verbal commands to the subject's brain for covert control of behavior. This topic did not go unnoticed in the post-Soviet space either. Publications began to appear in Russia about cases of sudden auditory hallucinations among former military personnel, especially those who had served in areas where closed military facilities were located. Some described nightmares in which the same images and phrases were repeated. Others spoke of clicks and metallic voices sounding like radio transmissions. Old archives of Soviet research were dug up, mentioning, among other things, experiments on influencing dreams, emotional states, and inducing auditory images. An extremely interesting episode occurred at the Canadian Embassy in Cuba in the mid-2000s when employees began complaining of unexplained symptoms, ringing in the ears, disorientation, dizziness. Their testimonies were so similar that the U.S. government took the matter seriously and launched an investigation. Later, similar cases were reported by American diplomats in China. This event went down in history as the Havana Syndrome. The official explanation was the impact of an unknown device, presumably acoustic. However, no such equipment was found. Against the backdrop of such events, theories emerged linking these phenomena to global projects such as HAARP, a program for researching the ionosphere in Alaska. According to official data, its purpose is to study the effect of high-frequency radio waves on the upper layers of the atmosphere. But critics of the project claim that HAARP is capable not only of affecting the atmosphere, but also of creating directed psychotronic fields that influence human behavior over vast distances. There was no direct evidence for this, but coincidences and circumstantial evidence gave rise to an avalanche of speculation. Equally alarming were rumors of a sleeping weapon that could be activated remotely. Some patents and technical descriptions pointed to the possibility of implanting micro-devices that could be activated when receiving a signal at a certain frequency. Such devices could theoretically cause muscle contractions, panic attacks, or even temporary fainting. This topic remains on the borderline between science and fiction, but interest in it is growing. As a result, a huge amount of evidence, reports, patents, and circumstantial facts have accumulated, which, when pieced together, paint a picture of a reality in which psychotronic warfare is not science fiction, but a hidden part of armed conflict. Voices in your head no longer seem so impossible when you know what modern technology is capable of and what goals those who control information can set for it. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, it seemed that with its disappearance, all its ambitious, frightening, and sometimes insane projects had disappeared as well. Documents marked top secret were either destroyed or sold, including to Western intelligence agencies. Many laboratories were abandoned, and equipment was cut up or taken away. It seemed that the race for mind control had come to an end, but a closer look revealed that it had simply gone underground. Fragments of archives began to surface in the former Warsaw Pact countries, confirming the existence of entire programs on neuropsychological influence. Among them were references to projects called Whisper, Stream, and Labyrinth. All of these were attempts to synthesize the effects of sound, light, and electromagnetic vibrations into a single control system. Employee testimonies pointed to the existence of experimental installations that were tested on both volunteers and prisoners. In Russia, the topic officially fell into oblivion, but strange applications began to appear in the pages of patent offices. In the early 2000s, devices were registered for influencing the emotional and volitional sphere of a person at a distance, remote psychocorrection systems, and even sleep phase control devices. All of this was presented as medical developments, but upon closer inspection, it became clear that these were old ideas in new packaging. In the United States and NATO countries, the approach was even more sophisticated. The development of neurotechnology, the emergence of brain-computer interfaces, and research into real-time cognitive influence all took place under the guise of scientific conferences and startups. However, rumors began to circulate among scientists that entire laboratories, supposedly closed, had in fact simply changed their name. Their employees left for the commercial sector, securing contracts with the military and special services. Thus, references to neuromodulation and cognitive engineering technologies began to appear in reports by the Rand Corporation and the U.S. National Institutes of Health. It would seem that we are talking about the treatment of depression and attention disorders, but between the lines, much broader possibilities could be read. The creation of artificial states of calm or anxiety, increased suggestibility, and the suppression of critical thinking. All of this could be used for more than just good. Online communities began to piece together these scattered clues. People suffering from strange symptoms shared their stories. Some claimed that they had started having panic attacks after buying a new smartphone. Others said that they heard commands in their heads after visiting the dentist. Of course, most of these claims can be attributed to psychological disorders. But what if at least some of them are real consequences of the impact of technologies that are unknown to the general public? Cases that were not officially commented on also played a significant role in maintaining the atmosphere of uncertainty. For example, mass panic outbreaks in schools, when dozens of children began to experience the same symptoms: dizziness, anxiety, speech disorders, or mysterious accidents caused by what was described as unexplained loss of orientation among drivers. All these events were surrounded by theories, most of which boiled down to one thing: mind control technologies have not disappeared. They have simply become invisible. Indeed, the 21st century is the age of information warfare. In the past, weapons fired bullets. Today, they fire ideas. Psychotronic influence is not an attack on the body, but an attack on perception. Control without violence. Subjugation without orders. In this world, there is no longer any need to slip LSD to test subjects. All you need to do is apply the right frequency, in the right place, at the right time. Thus, even in the absence of direct evidence, indirect signs indicate that the development of these technologies continues. And perhaps we are living in an era where the line between reality and programmed perception has long been blurred. We just don't know it yet. Today, the topic of psychotronic weapons sounds like a relic of the Cold War era. However, those who closely follow patents, incidents, and anomalies in everyday life notice that there are many indications that development is continuing, only in a different form and under different names. In the United States public patent databases, you can find dozens of applications describing devices for modulated behavior influence, soundless transmission of verbal signals, or radio frequency neurostimulation. For example, patent number 6,381,933 directly describes a method for inducing dreams with predetermined content. Others mention the possibility of creating emotional states using ultrasound. All these documents are officially registered and have authors, companies, and legal addresses, but they are not discussed in the press and do not appear in textbooks. There are also many strange incidents. In the 2000s, a wave of reports swept across Russia from drivers who claim to hear commands in their heads while driving. Some of them claim that they turned the wrong way, braked without understanding why, and felt orders. Psychiatrists explain this as stress, but the coincidences, especially in areas of former military facilities, were too frequent. In a number of countries, including China, South Korea, and Turkey, there are periodic reports of mass hallucinations or panic attacks. In most cases, investigations are closed without explanation. But within the expert community, there is a growing belief that someone may already be testing a new generation of weapons. Weapons that affect not the flesh, but perception. A report commissioned by NATO was also interesting, stating explicitly that by the middle of the 21st century, information and cognitive suppression technologies will pose the greatest threat. The authors of the document spoke about the possibility of introducing psycho-information viruses, patterns capable of rebooting the structure of thought. This is no longer science fiction. It is a prediction based on the current level of science. All these signs, patents, incidents, predictions, are coming together to form an alarming mosaic. We cannot see psychotronic weapons because they leave no traces. We cannot hear them because they make no noise. But that does not mean they do not exist. They may already be here.